Aussie larrikin who fleeced a major bank of more than $1.5 million, living the life of a high roller.
You could basically transfer as much money as you wanted to into your account.
The man who became a millionaire through an ATM glitch. What would you do if you found out that you can withdraw any money from the ATM, even the one that did not belong to you? Would you do the right thing, which is to report the glitch in the system? Or the greed for money would take over your moral responsibility, and you would enjoy taking other people's money? Today, we are going to look over the case of a man who won the lottery of his life and continued to withdraw cash until he became a millionaire. It was a shiny morning in 2011 in Australia, where Dan Saunders lived in Melbourne. Dan's profession was working at a casino, where he met people who came for gambling and drinking. His hours spent at the casino neutralized his attitude towards these acts and made him used to an environment where greed for money takes over everything. Soon, Dan found the love of his life and decided to spend the entire life with her. But suddenly an unexpected thing occurred when her girlfriend moved to the periphery of Australia in a small city with even less than 30,000 population. So, Dan decided to leave Melbourne and move to this city. He abandoned his job at the casino and switched various jobs in his new town, ranging from cleaning to working as a waiter at nearby restaurants. But luck soon favored him, and he got a job at a local casino. One evening, after finishing his duty, Dan closed the business and went for a drink with his close friend Mark in one of the nearby bars. As the late hours of the night approached, Mark decided to leave for his home while Dan was left alone in the bar by himself. Dan decided to drink even more to relieve himself, but to his surprise, his wallet was empty. To arrange for the payment, Dan went out of the bar to look for an ATM nearby. He went to the National Australian Bank's ATM at around 12:10 at midnight. Dan had two accounts, one for his savings and the other for his credit card. He inserted his savings card in an attempt to withdraw cash, but unfortunately it had a $0 balance. Dan now inserted his credit card, which showed a negative balance of $19.95. In desperation, Dan did something unusual. He tried to transfer $200 from his credit card to his savings account. An error message appeared on the ATM screen, and the bank rejected the transaction due to lack of money. Dan, instead of leaving the ATM due to his low balance, inserted his savings card instead and tried to check the balance. The screen displayed an error. DND didn't show the balance. Dan glared at the ATM screen and then tried to withdraw $200 again. What happened next was the biggest surprise for Dan. Instead of displaying the error of insufficient balance, the machine dispensed $200 in cash. This directly meant that the amount did transfer from credit card to the savings account, despite the ATM rejecting the transaction. At the moment, the drunk Dan did not ponder upon the glitch. He was only focused on paying his bill at the bar and drinking. Dan, at around 1 in the night, decided to leave for his house. However, due to the rain, he tried to shelter somewhere to avoid being wet. His only shelter was once again another bank's ATM. Now Dan began to wonder what had happened previously and decided to give it a try again. He inserted his credit card, which had the same balance of negative $19.95, and tried to send $200 in his savings account. The same error as before displayed, and the transaction failed. He then inserted his savings card and tried for a $200 withdrawal. To his surprise, the ATM dispensed a cash of $200. Now Dan started to do the same procedure over and over again. Instead of $200, he started to increase the limit from $200 to $400 and so on. That night, he returned with a wallet filled with $2,000 worth of cash. Dan now took a back seat. He had checked all his accounts before leaving the ATM, and the available balance stood at zero, while the credit debt was the same as before, a negative $19.95. Dan now waited for any phone call from the bank or relevant department in case the issue escalated, but no such thing occurred. Instead of anticipating in anxiety, Dan went one step ahead and called the bank himself. Upon his request, they sent him a bank statement, where his current savings account balance was negative $2,000. This meant that the system had corrected itself, and his withdrawal from the savings account had converted into debt. However, the strange point that caught Dan's attention was the peculiarity of the bank statement. There was no transaction record of the money being transferred from the credit card to the savings account. So, not only his credit card balance remained the same, he now had $2,000 in cash. That evening, Dan went to the supermarket and bought everything he could get his hands on, from home expenditure to appliances. That night, he even paid bills for his friends at a local bar until he was left with only $300. At that time in Australia, horse betting was a thing. Most of the bars across the country collaborated with betting companies. Dan was persuaded into this and decided to place a bet on the remaining $300. He thought if he could win the bet, he would pay off his debt of $2,000 that he owed the bank. However, he lost all of his gambling and was left with no cash and an additional debt of $2,000 in his savings account. This desperate condition pushed him towards the attempt to withdraw cash. He went to the same ATM for another operation at midnight again and inserted his credit card. He transferred $1,000 from his credit card into the savings account and went on to check the balance. To his surprise, his savings account was now showing a negative $1,000 instead of a negative $2,000. This meant that he had paid half his debt with the glitch. Dan replicated his previous procedure, and his luck hit a jet spot once again. He transferred $1,000 again, and this time the savings account showed a balance of $0. Next, he transferred $2,000 and then withdrew all that money. So not only did he pay off all his debt through his credit card, he also withdrew the additional amount of $2,000. Dan was now interested in the technical matter of this issue. Waking up the next day, he immediately called the bank and requested for his balance inquiry, but there was no change in his bank statement so far. His savings account still stood at $0, with no debt or transaction record to show. On the second day, the bank statement finally got updated. However, his debt was now $4,000 in the form of a negative balance. At that point, Dan understood two major things. One, that there is automatic correction in the system which eventually catches up with the transactions. Second, that it takes approximately 1 to 2 days until the bank's system updates. Over time, Dan felt that once he reached a significant amount of withdrawals, the bank would notice the negative balance and take action, which could result in freezing his account. He was continuously asking himself how to benefit from this glitch. One of the key things that Dan had realized early on was that the ATM went offline between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. and had no way of keeping a record of transactions in that time. So the only way he could benefit from this glitch is if he would go out at night to make the withdrawals. But this was not his major concern. The real hassle was the process of clearing off the savings account's debt, which was now up to $10,000. To make it easy for you, let's phrase it this way. As Dan would withdraw the money in the night, the ATM could not track it due to its disconnection with the bank. So, the transaction would show up in the records the next day. Therefore, in order to keep his savings account debt-free, he had to withdraw the money every single day, and in double value. For instance, if Dan had withdrawn $500 one day, he would have to withdraw $1,000 the next day, so he could pay off his debt, as well as withdraw $500. Another thing that turned out in his favor was that the bank allowed the transaction of 6 figures, which meant a withdrawal of $999,999. Dan decided to take the risk and started to withdraw substantial amounts from the National Australia Bank. He kept all of this information a secret from his friends and family. He didn't even share this with his beloved fiancée, who was not only very religious, but also a devoted Christian who taught children at school. Initially, he withdrew around $23,000 from the ATM. With the money in hand, he would gamble and drink in the bars. However, what created suspicion among the public was his constant free drinks to everyone in the bar. His job did not justify his lavish expenditure, but he justified it with his winnings at gambling on horse races. Dan started betting at big numbers to the point that he lost $40,000. On a weekday when Dan arrived at work for his shift, he overheard his boss talking with his betting company, where they informed them that
Dan's bets are worth thousands of dollars.
they even assumed that Dan might be deceiving them, as Dan was holding cash during that period. But upon checking it himself, Dan's boss found no difference in the amount collected and stored at the bar. The suspicion was natural because Dan was betting on the amount of money that bar would earn in an entire month. This led to severe consequences for Dan. Not only did the betting company suspend his account, but the bar fired him as well. They felt that Dan was doing something dubious that led him to earn these significant amounts, so they decided to cut all ties with him. Dan's residence in a small town backfired as well. The news spread across the town and his girlfriend broke up with him. She clearly asked him to stay away as she was not looking to join him in this dubious activity. Seeing things going sideways, Dan decided to share his little secret with his friend, Mark. Mark, upon seeing Dan falling into the pit of despair, planned a trip to Melbourne so they could relieve themselves from all the stress. Dan followed his schedule at Melbourne too, and with insane amounts of money being withdrawn, they were pulled towards gambling once again. In Melbourne, they would lose more money than their entire year's salary at casinos and bars. But since they felt they had unlimited money due to the glitch in the system, they did not seem to worry even slightly. Dan felt the surreal touch of richness. The wealthy life pulled him towards taking out more money each single day. The only problem that now arose was that ATM machines had limited funds in them, and Dan could not withdraw significant amounts every day. So Dan began to ponder on the possibility of cashing his account from inside the bank. Although he feared suspicion and legal authorities being involved, he still showed courage and decided to go into the bank for withdrawal. To avoid any suspicion, Dan went to the bank and asked for $1,000 only. The person in charge at the counter handed him his money, and upon his request, the bank employee checked his status. At that time, Dan's current balance stood at $537,027. Dan left the bank with more cash in his pocket, but now it started to stress him out. In the back of his mind, he was always expecting a phone call from the bank or a police knock at his door. Dan, however, was taking bigger steps now. He withdrew $20,000 in cash from the bank and everything went smoothly. The initial success made him slightly confident to apply for higher sums, and he went for the bold move of requesting to withdraw $100,000 in cash. This time, the employee did not simply hand him the cash, but went to the manager for approval. This was a time-consuming process, while Dan sat outside, anxious and worried. However, after about a quarter of an hour, the employee came back with the amount requested and handed him over his $100,000. Dan immediately left the bank with his anxiety peaking with every single step. Besides these huge amounts of cash being withdrawn, Dan felt that the bank would eventually catch him up once they started matching records and auditing. This was his opportunity of a lifetime, to withdraw the money as soon as possible and seize the moment. Dan wished to enjoy this moment at the highest level, so he picked up his phone and called his friends to come to Melbourne at his expense. They stayed at the most luxurious hotels and indulged in activities they had always dreamt of. The idea of endless money in Dan's mind led them to spend lavish sums at casinos, bars, shopping stores, and even restaurants. They even used limousines for traveling within the city. Dan even organized parties by renting out penthouses and pools. At restaurants, Dan would be the one to pay the bills for everyone. He even paid off his friends' loans and debts, and began to enjoy this life too much. His life of endless money knew no bounds. Within just 4 months, he withdrew over $1 million in cash. Deep down, Dan knew that sooner or later he would be in jail for fraud, so he wanted to enjoy as much as possible before he was caught. On top of his luxurious life, he was always worried and anxious about what was yet to come for him. Dan could no longer live under the constant pressure and fear and decided to end this routine of going to the ATM every night. He made one last transaction and his total withdrawal now stood at $1,600,000. The glitch worked for him for a day, however. For the coming days, he knew that the amount would be reversed into his account as a negative balance. What Dan anticipated did occur. He received a call from the bank where they notified him about some unusual activity and inquired Dan about it. However, Dan responded by saying,
"I did not realize the issue, and the bank should have informed me."
The bank told him they would set up the inquiry team if required, and he could be handed over to the legal authorities if the matter escalated. Dan put down his phone and sat there waiting for a phone call that would come for him. A few days passed, but no such call was received. After a month of anxiously waiting for the bank's decision, Dan decided to call them himself to relive the exhaustion he found himself at. The bank manager named Bernie told him that he had been caught in fraudulent activity. He stated that the matter had been worsened and he had been reported to the legal authorities who would handle this case. Dan was easy to track. Not only was his phone number easily accessible, but all his reservations at the hotel were under his name too. Months went by after his last call with the bank, and Dan was not approached by any authority. The fear of getting caught at any point turned Dan into a patient of severe anxiety. He even consulted some lawyers regarding the case, but they were also helpless because the case was incredibly unique and never heard of before. Dan continued to wait for someone to come for him. For over 2 years, he was told that the matter was under investigation, and inquiry would reach a conclusion, leaving him in a state of fear, anxiety, and worry. But nothing would come off even after 24 months had passed by. In 2016, after waiting for 2 whole years, Dan became a patient and regularly attended sessions with his psychiatrist. He now wanted to get it over with at all costs. So instead of waiting for the bank anymore, Dan decided to confess himself and contacted a major media house in Australia. The media house initially recorded his statement and then conducted an interview to create viewership and spice to the story. They even did a photo session of him in various places and areas, wearing expensive suits to show his previous past 4 months of luxury. For the first time, Dan's story was published across the globe, but the published article failed to complete its purpose and did not gather massive attention across the board for the bank to react. Now Dan tried to contact a TV show in Australia, A Current Affair, where he wished to explain his story and thus receive some update from the bank. The show took a week-long filming. They did extensive research, renting hotels and plans to capture his life of the 4 months of luxury he lived. This program was a success. It received major viewership around the country. Dan now believed that popularity of the show might now compel the bank to react to this issue. However, when the show aired, the host made up false news about his arrest warrants being issued and claimed that anyone who saw Dan must report to the police. Dan was furious at the professional journalists who made up a fake story just to put him in a worse condition. The producer of the program emailed Dan about the program and asked him to pay a visit to his office next Thursday to collect photos of the show if he wanted. At that point, Dan had realized that this was a scheme to plan his arrest. However, just to put an end to the things, he agreed to come to the media house next Thursday. That day, as he approached the station, Dan was surprised by all the cameras focusing on him from various news channels. He stood there as a policeman walked up to him and put him in a handcuff, while the media captured it live. Dan realized that his arrest was a plot by the news channels who wanted to end his story towards a conclusion, so they could receive all the credit for his arrest and improve their image in the eyes of the public. Following the arrest, Dan's fingerprints were taken and he was imprisoned without any investigation and case at the point. Dan's lawyers, however, raised a few points that changed the scenario entirely. The police officer who arrested him was the producer's friend and was not an official appointed for the case. So, technically, the police never opened his case. This was all just a TV channel's ploy to get some viewership. In addition, they realized that the bank never wanted to initiate this case and go public. For the bank, pursuing this case meant their credibility would go down due to a weak system and failure to catch up, which would shift their customers, and stock prices would drop. So the bank decided not to pursue the case and Dan was released. Since then, he has participated in various interviews and podcasts to tell history to the world. While Dan certainly found a massive glitch that made him a millionaire in days, in the end his moral obligation did take over him. Do you think Dan still has that money that he withdrew? Or was he honest when he said he spent it all? Do like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And until next time, stay curious.